Alex Morrison had never thought of himself as someone particularly attached to places, but the small house and the pond behind it had become something far more than just property. They were the threads of continuity in his life, binding him to his late father and to the long afternoons he had once spent at the water's edge as a boy. The property had been in the Morrison family for decades, purchased by his father in the early 70s, back when the land was still cheap and the outskirts of town had not yet been swallowed by suburban development. His father had been an architect with a peculiar passion for details, the kind of man who would sketch every tree line and measure the slope of the ground before planting a single post in the soil. He had not simply built a house, he had created a sanctuary that folded itself naturally into the surrounding landscape, and the pond, fed by a narrow spring that cut through the northern end of the land, had been his pride. He had gone as far as to draw up formal plans for the shoreline and register them at the county office, a precaution that seemed excessive at the time but would later prove invaluable. Alex had inherited the place after his father's passing, and though his life had taken him far from the rhythms of the town, university in another state, work that demanded constant travel, years of drifting in and out of projects and relationships, it was this modest stretch of water and earth that anchored him. When he finally moved back for good, the house bore the marks of time: peeling paint, a sagging porch, shutters that no longer closed properly. The pond itself, however, remained serene and unchanging, a mirror for the sky, alive with reeds, dragonflies, and the occasional heron. On summer evenings he would sit on the old bench his father had built, running his fingers across the weathered wood, and watch the water darken as the sun disappeared. There was something about the pond that reminded him of permanence, of something in the world that could be his alone, untouched by the chaos of modern life. Neighbors came and went, but Alex was not the kind of man who sought company or clung to social obligations. He exchanged polite greetings, helped once or twice with moving heavy furniture or clearing a fallen branch, but he rarely went further. His peace lay in the pond and the quiet routines around it, mowing the grass that rolled gently into the water, cleaning the leaves that drifted across its surface, and sometimes fishing at dawn with a simple rod, never caring much for the catch itself, but rather for the ritual, the silence. The pond was not grand, not even particularly deep, but it was his, delineated in the deed and recorded in surveys that his father had carefully filed away, as if foreseeing that one day Alex might need to defend it. And defend it he would, though he did not yet know it. At the time, Alex considered the pond unassailable, a feature of his life as steady as the seasons. He did not imagine that anyone could question his right to it or his father's foresight in securing those rights. It was a private thing, bounded by fences and trees, distant enough from the nearest road that strangers would never stumble across it. He trusted in the natural decency of boundaries, the unwritten law that what a man cares for and maintains belongs to him without dispute. That trust, however, was a fragile thing, and it was destined to be shattered in a way he could not have foreseen. For the moment, though, Alex allowed himself the comfort of believing that nothing could disturb the balance of his home. He woke each morning to the glint of sunlight on the water and went to bed each night with the soft rustle of reeds outside his window, carrying with him the unspoken certainty that this place, with all its quiet history, would remain his sanctuary, for as long as he chose to keep it. It was a Saturday morning in late spring when Alex first realized something was wrong. He had woken earlier than usual, stirred by the muffled sound of hammering that seemed to carry across the still water of the pond. At first he thought it was nothing more than someone repairing a fence or working on a deck nearby, the ordinary background noise of a neighborhood in which weekends were often dedicated to chores and projects. But when the noise grew louder and steadier, Alex stepped out onto his porch, coffee mug in hand, and looked toward the pond. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. A group of workers in neon vests were standing knee-deep in the shallows, anchoring large wooden beams into the bed of his pond. A small pile of lumber lay on the grass, and one man was already setting up a framework that unmistakably resembled the beginnings of a dock. For a long moment, Alex simply stared, too stunned to move, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were telling him. The pond had always been his, documented, maintained, undisputed. To see strangers casually driving posts into its soft earth as if it were a public construction site felt surreal, like some absurd dream. He set down his mug, marched down the slope toward the water, and raised his voice over the metallic clatter. The workers paused, looking at him with polite confusion, until a familiar figure appeared from the other side of the makeshift project. Karen, his neighbor from 2 houses over. Karen was a woman whose presence seemed to carry its own weather, a blend of confidence and condescension that made every conversation feel like an interrogation disguised as small talk. She wore a broad straw hat that cast a shadow over her sharp eyes, and she greeted Alex with a smile that felt rehearsed. "Good morning, Alex," she said cheerfully, as if she had simply caught him on a stroll. "I hope you don't mind a little activity on the water. I finally decided to do something I've been meaning to for years." Alex's voice came out harsher than he intended. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" She gestured gracefully toward the beams as if unveiling a gift. "A dock, of course. It's about time this pond had proper access. My grandchildren are coming to visit this summer, and I thought they would enjoy fishing or sitting out by the water. It's such a beautiful space, and it should be shared." The workers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension, but Karen continued without hesitation. "You see, Alex, water doesn't belong to anyone. It's a resource, a natural blessing, and I think it's rather selfish to keep it closed off. My grandfather used to fish here, long before your father even bought this place, and I grew up with the belief that the pond was part of our community. All I'm doing is restoring that tradition." Alex felt his pulse quicken, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He struggled to maintain composure, aware of the workers watching him. "This isn't community property, Karen. It's mine. It's in the deed. That pond has been part of this land for 50 years, and you can't just show up with lumber and claim it for yourself." Her smile hardened into something closer to a smirk. "Oh, Alex, you put far too much faith in paperwork. Deeds, surveys, bylaws, they change. What doesn't change is history. And history says this pond was never meant to be fenced off and hoarded. If you were a little more neighborly, you might see the benefit of opening it up. But don't worry, I'll take care of the expenses myself. You won't have to lift a finger." With that, she turned back to the workers, instructing them to continue, as if his protest carried no weight at all. The sound of hammers resumed, sharp and deliberate, and Alex felt a surge of helpless fury. He considered ordering the workers off immediately, but something in their cautious expressions told him they were only following the person who had hired them, and that person was standing right there with legal-sounding words and the confidence of someone who believed she could not be challenged. He retreated slowly, forcing himself to walk back toward the house, though his heart was pounding with the urge to drag every last beam out of the water with his own hands. All day, the construction went on. By evening, when the sun burned low across the horizon, a rough but undeniable dock jutted several feet into the pond. Karen stood on it proudly with her hat tilted back, waving to another neighbor who passed by as though she were unveiling an attraction rather than trespassing on someone else's property. Alex watched from his porch, silent and simmering, his coffee mug now replaced by a glass of whiskey he sipped without tasting. The dock seemed to mock him, an alien intrusion into a space that had always been his sanctuary. That night, Alex pulled out his father's old file cabinet and searched for the documents he knew were there. The original deed, the survey maps, the signed county records that clearly included the pond within their boundaries. The papers smelled of age, their edges yellowed, but the ink was sharp, the details precise. He spread them out across the table, highlighting the lines that marked the pond as part of the Morrison parcel. His father had been meticulous, almost obsessive about these things, and Alex felt a flicker of gratitude for that foresight. Still, the certainty of his legal position did little to calm the unease that spread through him. It wasn't just the dock, or even the audacity of Karen's words. It was the realization that someone could so brazenly ignore what seemed obvious and attempt to rewrite reality through confidence alone. For the first time, Alex sensed that his pond, his inheritance, his peace, was vulnerable. He stayed awake late into the night, listening to the quiet lapping of water against the new wooden posts, each hollow sound a reminder that his world had been breached, and that what had begun as an ordinary Saturday would mark the start of a battle. He had never imagined having to fight. Alex spent the next morning pacing along the edge of the pond, staring at the rough dock that jutted out into the water like a splinter embedded under the skin. The workers had left their equipment stacked neatly on Karen's lawn, and she herself appeared at one point with a thermos of coffee and waved at him as though nothing unusual had happened, as though building a structure on her neighbor's pond were the most natural thing in the world. The gesture only deepened his sense of violation, because it carried with it the smug assurance of someone who believed that her actions could not be undone. He had always thought of the pond as a silent ally, a constant that never argued back, but now every ripple seemed to reflect the presence of that dock, a reminder that his world was no longer intact. By midday, he had gathered every piece of paperwork he could find: the deed from his father, the surveys, even the county clerk's notations about the original registration of the property lines. With the folder tucked under his arm, he walked across to Karen's house and rang the bell. When she opened the door, the smell of freshly baked muffins drifted out, and she smiled warmly as if greeting an old friend. Alex held up the folder without preamble. "Karen, we need to talk. You've built something on my property, and I want you to see the proof." He laid out the documents on her polished dining table, tracing the boundary lines with his finger. "This pond is mine. Legally, officially, without question. What you're doing is trespassing, and it needs to stop." Karen listened politely, tilting her head as though she were indulging a child explaining some elaborate but mistaken theory. When he finished, she tapped one manicured finger on the edge of a survey map and said, "I'm sure these papers mean a lot to you, Alex, but they don't change the truth. The truth is that families around here have always used this pond. My grandfather swam here long before your father claimed it. Paperwork is just ink. History is what really counts." She pushed the folder back toward him with a gentle shove, smiling sweetly. "Besides, I've already spoken with a few neighbors and they agree the pond should be for everyone. Don't isolate yourself by clinging to technicalities." The words landed like stones in his chest. It wasn't just that she dismissed his evidence. It was that she had already begun building her narrative, weaving other people into it, planting seeds of doubt where none had existed before. He felt the ground beneath him shift, not literally but socially, as though his ownership of the pond were no longer a matter of fact but a subject up for debate. He left her house with the folder under his arm and an icy knot in his stomach, the realization dawning that Karen was not acting out of ignorance but out of strategy. That week, the tension grew in subtle but unmistakable ways. On Wednesday evening, Alex returned from work to find 3 lawn chairs set up at the end of the dock where Karen and 2 of her friends sat with fishing poles dangling into the water. They waved cheerfully when he appeared, as though inviting him to join, and one of the women even called out, "Lovely spot you've got here, Alex. Thank you for sharing." He wanted to scream that he was not sharing, that they were intruding, but the casualness of their demeanor made it difficult to frame his anger without seeming unreasonable. He retreated to his porch, watching in silence as they packed up at sunset, leaving behind empty cups and cigarette butts on the grass. On Friday, he discovered that Karen had organized a small picnic for her grandchildren on the bank. Bright blankets were spread over his lawn, toys scattered across the reeds, and the children ran laughing down the dock to toss pebbles into the water. Alex approached, his voice tight, and reminded Karen yet again that this was his property. She looked up from arranging sandwiches, her tone calm but firm. "Children need places to play, Alex. Are you really the sort of man who would deny them a bit of joy?" "You can keep waving those documents in my face, but to everyone else you'll just look like the neighbor who hoards a pond while children cry at the fence." That remark stung more deeply than he expected, because it revealed her weapon of choice. Not just intrusion, but reputation. She was painting him as selfish, unneighborly, and cold, while presenting herself as generous and community-minded. The conflict was no longer about wood and water. It was about narrative, about perception. He realized that she was willing to twist the story until he became the villain, and if enough people believed it, his papers might feel meaningless. On Sunday morning, he walked into town and requested a meeting with a local attorney, a woman named Lauren Shaw who had handled property disputes before. She listened carefully as he explained the situation, flipping through his documents with professional precision. "Legally," she said at last, "you're on solid ground. The pond is clearly part of your property, no ambiguity there. But if your neighbor continues to build or use it as her own, you'll need to be prepared for more than just legal measures. These cases often get ugly because they're as much about pride as about land." She advised him to document every incident, keep records of Karen's intrusions, and be ready for escalation. Alex left her office with a mixture of reassurance and dread. He had the law on his side, but the battlefield was expanding into social territory where the law held little sway. That evening, as he walked down to the water, he found that Karen had hung a lantern on the end of the dock. It swayed gently in the breeze, its light dancing across the rippling surface, as if declaring ownership in a language older than deeds and surveys. Alex stood there in the fading twilight, the papers heavy under his arm, and understood that the fight had only just begun. The weeks that followed were a slow erosion of Alex's peace, each day adding another small indignity, another sign that Karen had no intention of retreating from the dock or acknowledging the boundary that separated his world from hers. The pond, once the quiet heart of his home, had become a stage for her displays of entitlement, and what unsettled him most was not simply her presence, but the confidence with which she carried herself, as though she were certain that history and sentiment outweighed law. Alex documented everything as Lauren had instructed. Photographs of the dock, notes about the days she hosted gatherings, receipts for the litter he had paid to have removed when picnickers left their trash behind. Yet, even with a folder growing thicker each week, he felt a gnawing sense that documentation alone could not undo the damage being done to his claim. One evening, while returning from town, he noticed a delivery truck parked outside Karen's house. Several men unloaded more lumber, concrete blocks, and rolls of rope and carried them down toward the water. By the time Alex reached his porch, he saw them extending the dock further, hammering in fresh planks, adding cleats for tying boats. His anger burned hot, but he forced himself to watch in silence, knowing that storming down with raised voice would only give her more fuel for the image she was crafting of him as volatile and unreasonable. The following morning, he went to Lauren's office again and presented his photographs. She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled, her expression sharp. "She's escalating," she said. "And escalation is almost always a prelude to claiming formal rights. If she files with the homeowner association or with the county, you'll need to be ready. We should prepare a cease and desist letter, make it official." Alex agreed, though he knew that a letter might be little more than a piece of paper to someone who thrived on ignoring boundaries. The letter was delivered a week later, but instead of slowing her down, Karen responded with a maneuver Alex had not anticipated. At the next monthly meeting of the neighborhood association, she appeared with a portfolio of photographs showing families on the dock, children fishing, couples sitting by lantern light. She spoke eloquently, weaving a narrative in which the pond was described as a shared blessing, unfairly walled off by one neighbor's greed. Alex, who rarely attended these meetings, found himself blindsided by murmurs of agreement from residents who had never cared for the pond before, but were now swayed by Karen's performance. She claimed that her late grandfather had once received verbal assurances from a county official that the water was open for recreational use, and though she could produce no document, her words landed heavily in the room because they carried the weight of nostalgia. When Alex rose to speak, holding his maps and deeds, his voice carried the edge of desperation, and he sensed even as he spoke that the room was not on his side. He laid out the legal facts, the boundaries, the signatures, but against Karen's warm imagery of shared heritage, his words sounded clinical, even cold. The president of the association thanked him politely but suggested that perhaps a compromise could be reached, a suggestion that sent a chill down his spine. He left the meeting with his papers under his arm, and the haunting realization that even with law behind him, the tide of opinion could turn his sanctuary into contested ground. That night he sat by the pond, staring at the dock that now stretched boldly into the water, complete with handrails and ropes, a structure too deliberate to be dismissed as temporary. He thought of his father's meticulous drawings, the pride with which he had explained that ownership was not just possession, but responsibility. To see that responsibility twisted into a portrayal of selfishness wounded him deeply. It was then that he noticed something unusual. A stack of cement blocks half hidden in the reeds, each tagged with a sticker from a local supplier. Curiosity turned to alarm when he visited the supplier the next morning, only to learn that the order for the blocks had been placed under his name. The manager, a weary man with ink-stained fingers, retrieved the order form and pointed to a signature at the bottom. "That's yours, isn't it?" he asked. Alex stared at the scrawled name, identical to his own, but not his handwriting. His protests did little to sway the man, who insisted that someone had come in person, identified himself as Alex Morrison, and paid in cash. The realization struck like a blow. Karen, or someone working with her, had begun fabricating not just stories but documents, creating a paper trail that could be used against him. What chilled him most was the knowledge that such a tactic could not be easily dismissed. A forged order here, a counterfeit signature there, and suddenly his credibility could be chipped away, leaving him vulnerable. When he returned home, he found Karen waiting at the dock, her wide-brimmed hat tilted against the sun. She greeted him with a smile devoid of warmth and said, "You can fight, Alex, but I have patience. You'll tire before I do. People see me building something useful for everyone. They see you holding papers from another century. Ask yourself who they'll believe when the time comes." Alex clenched his fists, the urge to tear down every plank of the dock rising like a wave, but he forced himself to turn away. Instead, he walked back to the house, retrieved his father's old lockbox from the closet, and pulled out the original architectural drawings of the pond's shoreline. They bore not only his father's signature, but also the county registrar's stamp, a mark that proved their legitimacy. For the first time, he realized these fragile papers, which he had once kept only as sentimental relics, were his strongest shield. Yet, even as he held them, he understood that Karen would not stop with arguments or charm. She had stepped into the realm of forgery, and the battle ahead would not be won by documents alone. That night he dreamed of his father standing on the shore, pointing at the dock as though it were a scar, and saying in the calm tone Alex remembered from childhood, "A structure without foundation cannot last, but it can still cause damage before it falls." He woke with the dream echoing in his mind, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, knowing that the midpoint of this conflict had been reached. What had begun as a brazen intrusion had now transformed into a calculated campaign, and Alex, though armed with truth, was beginning to feel the immense weight of being one man against a neighbor who had turned deception into her greatest weapon. The discovery of the forged order gnawed at Alex in the days that followed, not only because it revealed the lengths Karen was willing to go, but because it demonstrated how vulnerable he was to tactics that required no confrontation, only quiet. Manipulation behind closed doors. He spent hours on the phone with Lorne explaining what he had found, faxing copies of the supplier's forms and listening as she outlined the grim reality. If Karen produced even more falsified paperwork, then every legitimate document Alex possessed would be dragged into doubt, and courts had a way of treating both sides as equally suspect when faced with conflicting evidence. For Alex, the realization was maddening, because it meant the truth of his ownership might be obscured not by law, but by the sheer audacity of deception. Tension escalated in the neighborhood as well. Where once his pond had been regarded with indifference by others, it was now the subject of quiet debates and whispered judgments. One neighbor, who had always waved cheerfully, now crossed the street without greeting him. Another muttered, "You should let her be, Alex. It's just water," as if centuries of property law could be reduced to a trivial dispute over something fluid, and therefore, in their eyes, unownable. Karen cultivated these sentiments skillfully, inviting families to the dock, encouraging children to fish or swim, all while presenting herself as a generous matriarch, opening her space for others to enjoy. The irony that it was not her space at all seemed lost on them, or worse, deliberately ignored, because the convenience of her dock outweighed the discomfort of siding with Alex. The real blow came when he received a thick envelope delivered by certified mail. Inside was a formal complaint filed with the county, alleging that his fencing and shoreline improvements violated environmental codes. The complaint bore his name as the accused and Karen's as the petitioner, complete with photographs of rocks and reeds arranged to appear as though he had disrupted the natural water line. Alex recognized the photographs instantly. They were his pond, but the perspective was skewed, the framing designed to make normal maintenance look like destruction. He sat at his kitchen table staring at the papers, the knot in his stomach tightening with each line of text, realizing that this was no longer a matter of neighborly disputes but an orchestrated attack designed to trap him in bureaucracy. Lauren assured him that the complaint would not hold, because his father's original architectural plans already included the shoreline work and the county had approved it decades ago. Still, hearings would be scheduled, responses filed, time consumed, and all of it would give Karen the opportunity to spread her story further. Alex felt as if he were standing in quicksand. The more he tried to assert his rights, the more entangled he became in processes that drained his time and energy while Karen thrived on the conflict itself. One night, unable to sleep, he walked to the pond and found Karen already there, seated on a folding chair at the end of the dock, lantern glowing beside her. She looked at him without surprise, as though she had expected him, and said softly, "You should give up, Alex. You're fighting a tide you can't control. The water wants to be shared. People believe in me because I believe in them. You're just a man clinging to dead paper." The calm conviction in her voice chilled him more than if she had shouted, because it revealed that she truly saw herself as the custodian of some higher truth, unconcerned with the legality of her actions. The following morning he installed cameras along his property line, not because he expected them to deter her — Karen had already shown that she was not afraid of being seen — but because he needed proof for the hearings that lay ahead. Within a week, the cameras captured her grandchildren trespassing again, splashing in the water while she stood nearby with folded arms, daring him to object. When he confronted her, she laughed, her voice carrying across the water. "Go ahead, Alex, show your little videos in court. They'll see children playing, and they'll see you as the bitter neighbor trying to take joy away from them." The sense of futility pressed against his chest like a weight, but beneath it a spark of resolve began to grow. He realized that if Karen's strategy was to drown him in paperwork and perception, his counter had to be patience, persistence, and the ability to outlast her. It was not enough to have the truth. He would need to wield it with the same endurance his father had once shown when fighting for permits and approvals to ensure that the pond was fully his. Karen might wield deception, but deception eventually left cracks, and Alex intended to find them. As summer deepened, the pond no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a battlefield. The dock loomed like an occupying force. Children's laughter turned into barbs, and the rustle of reeds in the evening carried with it the echo of accusations yet to come. And still, even as the pressure mounted, Alex understood that he had crossed a threshold. The fight was no longer about a piece of water, but about whether truth could survive the relentless grind of lies. The hearing took place in the county courthouse, a building of red brick and heavy oak doors where the air always seemed too still, as if time itself moved reluctantly within its walls. Alex arrived with Lauren by his side, the thick folder of deeds, surveys, and his father's original drawings weighing down his briefcase like a stone. Across the aisle, Karen sat with a lawyer whose polished shoes and immaculate suit seemed designed more to impress than to argue, and she greeted Alex with a smile that was both triumphant and pitying, as though she already believed the outcome was inevitable. The judge, an older man with a reputation for patience, opened the proceedings with deliberate calm, but even his measured tone could not slow the pounding of Alex's heart. Karen's attorney began with an elaborate speech about community heritage, invoking decades of shared memories, the stories of her grandfather fishing at the pond, and the supposed injustice of allowing one man to monopolize what had always been a communal resource. He presented photographs of children on the dock, of neighbors gathered at the water's edge, each image carefully chosen to frame Karen as the guardian of joy and Alex as the miser withholding it. Then, with a flourish, he produced a letter, aged paper, yellowed at the edges, bearing what he claimed was the signature of Alex's late father, purporting to grant permission for shared use of the pond. Gasps murmured through the small crowd of observers, and Alex felt his stomach twist. He knew instantly the letter was a fabrication, yet its appearance was devastating, because it struck at the very foundation of his inheritance. Lauren rose slowly, her voice measured but firm. She dissected the supposed letter with precision, pointing out inconsistencies in the seal, the irregularity of the handwriting, and the absence of any record in the county archives. She presented expert testimony in the form of a handwriting analyst who confirmed that the signature did not match authenticated samples. Then she laid out the architectural drawings Alex had preserved for decades, complete with county registrar stamps that no forger could reproduce. Piece by piece, she dismantled the illusion Karen had constructed, until the judge himself leaned forward and asked Karen's attorney whether he had verified the authenticity of the document before presenting it. The tension in the room shifted, the murmurs now directed not at Alex but at Karen, whose confident smile faltered for the first time. When her attorney stammered about family records and oral assurances, the judge's expression hardened. Lauren pressed the advantage, producing Alex's photographs, the recordings from his cameras, and sworn affidavits from the supplier who confirmed that the construction orders had been placed under Alex's name by an imposter. The weight of evidence grew until it was no longer a contest of narratives but a mountain of fact crushing the thin scaffolding of lies. When the judge finally spoke, his words carried the gravity of finality. He declared the dock an illegal structure erected without permission on private property, ordered its removal within 30 days at Karen's expense, and referred the matter of the forged letter to the district attorney for further investigation. Karen sat motionless, her hat resting on her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line as if holding back a torrent of words that would serve no purpose. Alex felt no triumph in that moment, only a profound exhaustion, the release of months of tension that had wrapped itself around his life like a tightening coil. As he left the courthouse, Lauren placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "You didn't just win, Alex. You exposed her. That's what will linger." He nodded, though his eyes were fixed on the horizon beyond the courthouse steps, where the sun was lowering and casting long shadows across the pavement. For the first time in months, the thought of the pond did not fill him with dread, but with the faint memory of peace, though he knew it would take time before the water once again reflected only sky and not conflict. The dock came down in pieces, stripped away by a crew hired not by Alex but by the county under the terms of the order, and he stood at a distance watching as each plank was pried loose and hauled onto the grass. the sharp echo of tools carrying. Across the water, there was no satisfaction in seeing it destroyed, only a weary recognition that the fight had left scars deeper than wood in soil, scars on his trust in neighbors, in the quiet order of the life he had once taken for granted. Karen did not appear that day, though her curtains twitched once as if she had been watching from behind the glass, unwilling to face the sight of her work undone. By evening, the shoreline was bare again, the pond unbroken, the ripples moving freely as though erasing the memory of intrusion. In the weeks that followed, neighbors who had once sided with Karen offered awkward greetings, some muttering apologies, others pretending nothing had happened at all. Alex accepted none of it as vindication, only as proof that loyalty in a neighborhood could be as fragile as reeds in the wind. He repaired the patches of earth where the dock had torn into the bank, planting grasses and reeds from the same sketches his father had drawn decades ago, restoring the shoreline with deliberate care. When the work was finished, he left one of the old concrete blocks half buried at the edge of the water, not as an oversight but as a reminder, a quiet monument to the conflict, a warning to himself that even something as steady as a pond could be contested if one person decided to believe their desire outweighed the truth. Sometimes, in the still evenings, Alex would sit by the water and hear again the echo of Karen's words, her conviction that water belonged to everyone, her insistence that history could override law. Yet, as the moonlight rippled across the surface, he knew that what endured was not her claim but his father's care, his own persistence, the weight of documents that had outlasted deception. The pond was his once more, but more than that, it had become a testament. Boundaries mattered, truth mattered, and defending them was not selfishness, but survival.